Hello guys, welcome to the fiction series. Today we are gonna see, what if Hitsugaya Toshiro remembered his life as Naruto? Part 1. If you want more awesome fan fiction like this, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, so without wasting any time let's get into the video. This was not his office. This was not Sarate. For the first time since the end of the war, the fragile peace that Hitsugaya had known had shattered. He was anguished, more than anything, when the world around him seemed to bleed in from the white static that had suddenly engulfed him. He stared around him, expression blank, seeing faces far too familiar but so distant from who he was now. Pink hair, pale eyes, dark hair, spiked hair, pulled back in a ponytail, black, charcoal eyes on an ashen pale face. Sakura, Hinata, Shikamaru, Sai, his mind hissed, taunting him of what he had long since lost and could never regain. He took a soft breath, his hair trait skyrocketing as his arms were suddenly bound. He looked down to the chakra restraints that clasped tightly onto his wrists, bleeding seals onto his pale skin. He breathed, there was no need to lose his composure. He had suffered far worse. Oh? He heard a voice, one that seemed eerily familiar. You're Uzumaki Naruto. This is not what I had expected when I tried to resurrect you, but now things have gotten interesting. He took a slow breath then, and let his Ryatsu loose. The binds that held his wrists froze quickly, and he flexed his arms to shatter them. He flash-stepped a distance away, his eyes narrowed and gazed dark. Sit upon the frozen heavens, he said, slowly, drawing his sword. He swung the blade out at the ninja who seemed so familiar, yet so different, with that scaled skin, those slit eyes, that gray hair, those glasses. Hyorin Meru. The dragon roared as it flew from his blade, and he bared his teeth as it crashed into the cavern ceiling, breaking the mountain face open, disregarding the enemy before him. He had no desire to face this past that was so far gone, now. He had no desire to rip those old wounds open, again. He couldn't bear to see the pain on those people's faces, those who had been his friends, once. He couldn't focus on that. He stared down at the gathered ninja, both Rogue and Konoha, his expression remaining passive, standing seemingly on thin air. This seemed to take the present ninja aback as he held the sword at his side. Where do you think you're going, Jinchuriki? Kabuto called up after him. Do you not feel any sort of concern for your own former comrades? The dead, he said, coolly, have no place among the living. I do not know how so little time has passed here since I departed, but it is to your own detriment. You have made a terrible mistake by bringing me back. Oh? You've become quite arrogant. There was nothing but amusement to Kabuto's expression as he replied, his posture open and clearly lacking the fear that Hitsugaya felt he should have. It made his blood boil in a way that he hadn't felt in a long time, and he wondered, then, what his problem was. Are you so sure of yourself after you overtaxed your body following your legendary battle with pain? I was young, Hitsugaya countered, letting a hint of his Ryoku free, letting the cold chill his skin in a welcoming comfort against the harsh sunlight. And I was beepy. My enemies in the afterlife have been more than you could hope to be. You are continuing to blunder about like an insignificant child by underestimating me. He disappeared in another flash. Choked gasps rose up from the present four as a spray of blood opened up from the new wound freshly made on Kabuto's chest. Hitsugaya stood behind him, blade in hand and stained red. Kabuto clasped the wound, looking alarmed. I did not even have to activate my Shikai to injure you, Hitsugaya's voice came coldly, breaking the suffocating silence. Kabuto's eyes narrowed before he tilted his head back, his glasses glaring in the sunlight that flooded through the destroyed mountain face. So I should attempt a different tactic, then. There was a blur of movement, but considering Hitsugaya's skill he could see where it was going. In a flash he vanished, and the three kunai that had been launched at Hinata crashed into the Zanpakuto, bouncing off it. Kabuto's lip twitched, and Hitsugaya sneered. Don't think me so weak, Hitsugaya hissed in a harsh whisper, the words almost a growl. You'll find yourself regretting that. I do believe you've forgotten how this world works, Kabuto replied smugly. It was then that he realized too late that there were exploding tags on the kunai. The blast of smoke and explosives obscured the cavern. Sakura threw her hands up in front of her face to minimize the impact of any debris. Sai and Shikamaru both took the opportunity to jump back, and then Sakura followed them, her eyes narrowing. Did you see Hinata? Sakura asked, worry seeping into her voice. Shikamaru shifted his body lower, his eyes narrowed as he took in the situation around them. No, Shikamaru said, biting his lip for a moment. But that guy had her back, at least. Sakura tensed. So you two are tentative to label that strange boy as Naruto as well? Sai asked. Sakura wanted to be mad, honestly. Truly, she wanted to take offense to Sai's reluctance to believe that Naruto was brought back. But the boy that stood before them was an echo of a boy that shouldn't have existed, yet was also so different from anything she knew. And he was so cold. Just like Sasuke. Just like ice. Shikamaru jerked forward a bit, his eyes widening a bit. Sai and Sakura turned their attention out, leaving the conversation by the wayside. After all, there were far more important things going on. Like a massive jagged spire of ice being left in the fading smoke. Shikamaru sagged in relief to see Hinata. This was supposed to be a simple reconnaissance effort, Sai murmured under his breath, only loud enough for Sakura and Shikamaru to hear. Truly, he was getting the hang of the whole social interaction thing, even if he was still having mild issues with his social awareness. Shikamaru grumbled a bitter how troublesome as well, and Sakura finally saw the reason why. Hinata swallowed. She had, for a moment, been disoriented by the attack from how quickly it had come. More disorienting had been the heat of the explosives, and then a cold so intense it burned. She had wrapped her arms around herself and huddled, intent on minimizing the damage due to how close she was to the attack. But she wasn't hurt. She looked up sharply, her Byakugan active, and then gasped. "Naruto-kun," she breathed. Her Hitsugaya was before her, his haori torn and stained with blood, a giant frozen obelisk surrounding them. Clearly, the defensive measure had absorbed the brunt of the damage, but Hitsugaya still hadn't been quick enough. But that was not the reason why she knew, suddenly, that this was Naruto. His eyes were terrified, a fear that was reflected that she knew so intimately, that haunted her dreams for years, and she could only stand there, frozen, transfixed by that gaze because it was him. He was afraid for her. And then he was angry. Which was, in fact, the nail in the coffin for his identity, for anger meant that a beast which had long since laid dormant was now awake. Now, being in such a chakra-rich environment, the Kyuubi's chakra flooded out of Hitsugaya in a maelstrom, and Hitsugaya roared, Hyorinmaru falling from his hands as he shattered the ice around him, sending a frigid hail of jagged icicles in Kabuto's direction. Kabuto only watched in amusement as Hitsugaya was enveloped in a cloak, rapidly ascending to a three-tailed form. "Naruto-kun, wait," Hinata stammered out, alarmed, but she barely had time to brace herself as Hitsugaya lunged away from her, a shockwave slamming into her from how fast he'd moved. This wasn't the Naruto she knew, even if he was Naruto. She regrouped with the others, uncertainty in her eyes. Though nothing was said as they readied themselves to defend themselves and combat Kabuto, they knew for certain that this all was wrong. How could it come to this? Hitsugaya wondered it, struggling against the haze in his mind, battered by wave after wave of his own internalized rage turned against him. He moved without his own will, taken by instinct to tear the smug grin off Kabuto's face. He was livid, possessed by a feeling he'd so long gone without that it was stronger than he remembered. The chakra cloak consumed him, whisker markings etching themselves in dark relief on his cheeks as if they had never left, his pupils slitting as the irises grew red. Black rims stretched along his lips and his eyes, and he crouched low to the ground, hair drifting lazily in the wave of the living chakra. The Kyuubi, as ever, was relentless. Regret twisted in the corners of what parts of his mind weren't oriented to the fight. He should have tried to tap into the power while in the safe confines of Sirte. Should have tried to harness his latent powers and learn how to suppress it. He should have tried, instead of looking to bury his past where it belonged. At least then, he'd have control. And he hated it. He hated his indecision. The choice he made, languishing on his own mistakes in that moment, was to his detriment. His own dark thoughts were but cannon fodder to the ancient-tailed beast that dwelled within him, and he was only engulfed further by its hateful will. Yes. Give in. Things were quickly going downhill the longer that Kabuto and Naruto fought. Shikamaru held out a hand, a silent order to the rest of the team that they would hold their positions and not duck in just yet. Sakura clenched her fist, a sure sign that she wanted to act. "Hinata," Shikamaru said lowly, his eyes not leaving the fight as Kabuto's snakes lunged for the three-tailed Shinigami captain. "What happened? What did you see?" Hinata curled her hands together, wringing them fretfully as she tracked the battle with her Byakugan, her worry only mounting with each second that crawled by. The Kyuubi's chakra was growing in presence at an exponential rate, and she was sure that if it continued the rest of their team would come. Not once for the first time, she felt a nagging sense of self-doubt, thinking that if Niji had come on this expedition in her place, he'd be able to act better. But, sparing one glance to Sakura, she shook herself of her worries. She wasn't going to let herself fall into that defeatist thinking. Not anymore. They'd come a long way in the 5 years Naruto was dead. She said, her voice hoarse, "I saw his eyes. Those eyes are Naruto's." He was so afraid. "I've seen those eyes before, when pain, Sakura reached out and placed a hand on Hinata's shoulder. Hinata nodded gently, taking a soft breath as she gathered her wits about her. Now was not the time to be distracted by bad memories, by memories of Kakashi returning to the village in grief, holding in his arms the hero who had died a death he didn't deserve simply by overtaxing himself. No. Now wasn't the time to focus on that. "What are you seeing right now, in the battle?" Sai asked lowly, the furrow of his brow the only hint of any emotion on his face, as he bepised the situation before them. Hinata pursed her lips, tracking the movement of each combatant. Kabuto's movements were calculated, but Naruto his movements were wild, unpredictable, unplanned. He wasn't thinking. There aren't any genjutsu active, she said softly, casting her eyes down, even as she kept tabs on the battle. And Naruto-kun's chakra circulatory system is functioning identically to that which he had before he died, Sai finished, quietly. Hinata, Sakura and Shikamaru all lowered their heads with Sai in quiet mourning acknowledgement of the loss. Yes, Hinata finally replied. But he is much faster than he was before. He has this way of moving, it's difficult to explain, but it looks like some sort of energy and Hinata's brow furrowed. I've never seen something like it before, but it gathers under his feet and he uses it as a means of accelerating his movement. But he's not thinking about what he's doing. I don't what do we? Shikamaru leaned back on his heels, his thoughts racing at the words he'd been told. This didn't make sense. How could Naruto have changed so drastically in 5 years in the afterlife? To wield a power so different from anything he'd ever used and with such mastery, to move like an expert warrior when he should only logically be 20, to appear as if his age was less than as he died. None of this made any sense. Not in a logical frame of mind. Something was wrong here and at this point, as frustrating as the situation was, the only thing Shikamaru could do was make conjectures about what happened to Naruto after his death. He didn't like that at all. Sakura, Shikamaru said carefully, do not engage unless the situation is dire. If things go any further than this. Sakura looked away, lip twitching. I don't like it, Shikamaru, she said quietly. You're the only one of us that was trained under Tsunade-sama, Sai cut in, dashing her grouchiness about the situation in a way that only irritated her more. With Naruto's current state, your skills will be necessary. Conserving your chakra is the only way to proceed. Sakura hated that Sai was right. Really, Shikamaru said, lip twisting, at this rate, I think letting them fight each other instead of us is the optimal plan. We aren't intended to engage. This is troublesome. The clock was ticking down to the moment that the rest of their assigned group would come after them and escalate the situation. All that Team 7, 8, 9 and 10 were supposed to be doing was a border inspection, truthfully. Though the additional intel indicated rumored Akatsuki movement and rogue ninja activity in the typical fashion of outlying villages bullying each other relentlessly for whichever reason. It was supposed to be routine to potentially dangerous, not this. Things, of course, would only continue to get worse. Hitsugaya was livid. No, livid was an understatement. The fury that ignited a resentful fire that seared him from the inside out was unimaginable, just on the edge of absolute torture. Every time he struck, he'd hit a mass of snakes posturing as his target, or he'd be deflected. Takra scalpels would cut into him in a way he was no longer accustomed to anticipating, and though his skill in Hakuta wasn't necessarily neglected, the fact that Taijutsu was a strong point of combat in this world had him now disadvantaged. What's wrong, Naruto? Kabuto taunted, smile wide across his miserable pasty face that Hitsugaya wanted to punch off him. Hitsugaya snarled, his eyes widening as he lunged a fist forward, only to have it deftly deflected. His attacks were only growing sloppier as the Kyuubi weighed him down, the edges of his vision were going black and tunneling. This wasn't good. What have you, and Hitsugaya enunciated each word with an attempted punch. Done to me? His last words came with a heavy growl as his chakra arms extended outward, whip-like as they chased after Kabuto and his massive snakes. Oh. That's not me, Naruto-kun. Don't call me that, Hitsugaya roared, baring his sharpened canines, his eyes losing a bit more of their sharp cognizance. Kabuto laughed. You really are the same as ever. For all your talk of arrogance, you are easy to rage, and you always look to throw the first punch. Shut up. The words were shrieked at this point as Hitsugaya grappled one of the few remaining stalactites, yanking himself forward to lunge. He roared, incensed, as his attack yielded nothing but a harsh impact on the cavern floor, and he looked around, lowering himself into a crouch on the floor, tense and hardwired to attack. You're weak, Naruto, Kabuto continued. You haven't changed a bit. Hitsugaya snarled as he was abruptly flanked by a flood of snakes, pain shooting through him as their miserable little fangs sunk into his skin, as if they deserved the hit. He tore at the snakes, the caustic nature of the Kyuubi's cloak causing them to burn away in his fingers. Weak. How was it that he'd become weak again? Hadn't he gone through so much trial and so much strife in the past 7 years? All that consumed him now were memories of every mistake he'd ever made, with time his effort had been squandered, with his judgment failing, and it circulated violently with the blood that pulsed in his ears. He hardly even felt the skin tearing off and disintegrating into the cloak. He hardly noticed his vision rapidly tunneling. He hardly noticed the rumble of the storm above and the sudden violent snowstorm around them. He hardly noticed the scream of his old name in the edge of his awareness, so lost to his spiral was he. Everything went dark. No. Sakura shouted, alarmed and afraid. Naruto. The characteristic black dome that heralded the arrival of Naruto's four-tailed form solidified around the Jinchuriki before a pillar of condensed chakra shocked the sky, blasting away the clouds. The beast in his place let out a shrieking roar, lunging in a flash to slam its fist into Kabuto's gut. Kabuto wasn't smiling anymore. Rather, he was sent flying back, slamming through the wall of the cavern as a blast of dust and debris flew out towards them. The beast growled and lowered itself, its eyes narrowing. Then, seeing that its prey wasn't coming back out, it turned on the four Konoha shinobi. Hinata was frozen in its presence, her eyes wide. Sai was pulling out a scroll to use his Choju Giga for a rapid escape, and Shikamaru grit his teeth. "Shit," Shikamaru hissed, folding his hands in the seal to use his shadow imitation technique. The shadows spread out in the cracks, racing towards the beast, but it responded by lunging a stretched hand out to slam Shikamaru into a wall. Shikamaru gasped, the breath knocked clean out of him, his ribs letting out quite the unpleasant cracking sound from the impact. Sakura, no longer letting herself be idle, let out a yell of Shanro. As she slammed a chakra-charged fist into the arm holding Shikamaru. The beast stumbled off to the side, shaken off its initial attack by the impact. Shikamaru sank to the ground. Drawing complete, Sai threw up a seal for Ninpo. Choju Giga, a bird screeching as it peeled itself from the scroll, stretching its wings. Shikamaru stumbled up, holding his ribs. "We need to retreat. Yamato Taichu should." "Wait," Hinata said, softly, her eyes widening. The three looked to the beast, which hadn't taken the opportunity to attack. The beast, however, froze in its tracks, ice crawled up its limbs, and it looked down, its body taut as if something were fighting it. "Something in him is fighting back," Hinata breathed, her eyes wide. "His own energy is disrupting the cloak." Hate. Hate was all he felt. Hate was all he knew. Master. Hate was everything he was. It was all that mattered. It was all he was. Master. He couldn't fight it. He hated everything. Master. Hitsugaya took a deep gasping breath, only to find himself drowning in the Kyuubi's chakra. He choked around the red water, coughing and flailing as he reached his hands out. He saw a glint of bright blue, of ice, of familiarity he so yearned for. He felt eyes boring into his skin, and he turned, seeing the red, burning eyes of a beast. It was all hazing around him, almost a fever dream, and he coughed again, struggling to move back. But the water around him was suffocating, choking, and he was drowning. "Release him, foul beast." Orochimaru's voice boomed in a violent, demanding echo. A massive claw swiped down, narrowly missing Hitsugaya who jolted back. Orochimaru, Hitsugaya choked out, so desperately yearning to breathe. A tail swung into the water, and he reached out, grabbing onto it with the rest of his strength. He heard a wailing roar of pain from Orochimaru, his eyes widening as they broke free from the surface of the water. "Come and fight me, face to face," the fox growled out, the deepness of his voice vibrating the area around them. Hitsugaya's focus was slipping, as was his grip, it was too hot. He was suffocating in the heat. He would die here. He couldn't hold on, he wasn't. "You will not die, master," Orochimaru growled, and the breeze of Orochimaru's massive wings spreading and beating down around him was a welcome relief. Hitsugaya couldn't keep track of what was happening around them, as blacks and reds bled into blues and whites. It was the biting, familiar chill that clued him into where he was. The field of ice. "Oh," Hitsugaya was relieved to be here. "Rest, master," Orochimaru's voice soothed. Hitsugaya wasn't sure if he'd even remember what had happened, nor could he truly process what had happened. All he knew was that he was tired. He was so tired. The blast of steam from ice fighting fire was what resulted from the internal battle, as Orochimaru and Hitsugaya triumphed over the Kyuubi's control for the time being. The sheer heat followed by the frigid ice as it blasted out was enough to put an end to the fighting. In the wreckage, Hitsugaya lay prone as he came back to himself. He was paralyzed by the Kyuubi's damage, and now that his mind was clear again, he was stunned by how taken he was by the Kyuubi's chakra. He panted heavily, struggling to move his arm and wincing when shockwaves of pain traveled up his exposed dermis. But he wasn't going to stop yet. He dragged himself closer to Orochimaru, making another gasping breath. He needed Orochimaru. He had to find a way to leave, he wasn't supposed to be here. His office in Sirte, his division was so far from his grasp, and all that remained for him here were taunting visions of the past he had lost to the most unfair of circumstances. He wanted to go home. His hand collapsed as soon as he did, his head falling to the ground. He laid there, limp, blissfully lost to the world as unconsciousness finally claimed him. Hinata came over, carefully supporting Shikamaru as she went, Sakura and Sai taking up the end. Once they got close enough to Hitsugaya, Sakura bent down, swallowing hard as she rolled the Shinigami over. "I can't believe this," she said, touching his face. He felt cold, and she flinched a bit. Certainly, he felt dead as he was, but he was breathing, softly, which convinced her of his at least dubious life after death. And now the marks were there, those whiskers, and it made his being Naruto all the more real. I didn't think when he was saying that he was going to bring Naruto here, It seemed impossible, Shikamaru added, nodding solemnly. I get that. Man, this is so troublesome. Sakura bit her lip and turned to Shikamaru. Here. Let me heal you. No, Shikamaru interrupted, shaking his head. My injuries aren't horrible, I'll live long enough to get to Ino. But Naruto's in worse shape. Take care of him. Though she wanted to argue, he was thinking logically. So she reached out her hands and laid them over Naruto's chest, focusing before a vibrant green glow took over her hand. Sai was moving forward instead of sticking with the group, heading towards the impact site. He got away, Sai said, quietly. That's not a good thing. Word will get out that he summoned Naruto with that twisted Edo tensei of his, Shikamaru hissed, lip curling. Damn it. He looked over at a touch to his shoulder, seeing Hinata there, one hand held to her chest. But, she said gently, he didn't get Naruto-kun. Isn't that the most important part? Shikamaru's lip twisted. Well, that was true, and they got Naruto, what was left of the Naruto who they knew so well under the cold facade of the person that had spoken when first summoned. I don't think we can continue this mission. We have to go back to the village. I'll go back, Sakura said, firmly. We will go back, Sai corrected. Are we not Team 7? Sakura smiled sadly. You're right. And with the plan in place, the frayed remains of Team 7 took off, flying off to Konoha with urgency speeding them along. Heading back to the village was easier said than done. Sakura and Sai had to care for a downed ally and had to stay low enough to not attract attention. After all, Kabuto could still be lurking around and the rumors of Akatsuki activity were nothing to sneeze at. Sakura was jumpy, holding Naruto close and secure so that they wouldn't lose him off the edge of the Inkbird. As nightfall was fast approaching and that the location of their mission was close to the border and far from the village, the two ultimately decided to make camp for the night. It wouldn't do to try and force a straight shot to the village. Especially not when Naruto was still unconscious and showing no signs of recovery. So soon enough, Sai was crouching over a fire and Sakura was running her healing ninjutsu over Naruto's form again, her brow furrowing. He should have been awake by now, Sakura said, worriedly, finally pulling her hands back. She sat down as she looked into the small fire they'd started for the night. For a brief moment, she cast a glance to Naruto, whose expression was drawn, almost more exhausted than he'd been earlier. Something's wrong. He does look bad, he agreed quietly, frowning. Naruto didn't move at all. But I couldn't find anything wrong with him, she said. His vitals seem perfectly healthy, his wounds are fairly cleared up, he's not. She grabbed her arms tightly. I don't understand. It could be something that you are unaware of now, Sai commented, folding his hands in front of his mouth. We know nothing of him as he is. Sakura soured. Even though the answer was logical and likely the true response to her question, it didn't feel right to her. She couldn't stand the idea of Naruto being so far away from her now, so distant as Sasuke was. Now that there was a lull in the situation, she hunched, her fingers gripping tighter into her skin, knuckles going white. Sai tilted his head to the side in confusion. Are you upset? He asked. She shook her head. It's frustrating. She looked up, seeing Sai's confused expression, and then looked to Naruto again, watching the shallow rise and fall of his chest, the very subtle twitches of pain to his face. Not knowing what happened to him after we lost him. Not knowing what made him like this. Not knowing how to help him, not knowing how to reach him. Sai's confusion only persisted. But he's sitting right there. After a few moments of silence, his expression cleared up. Ah. You don't mean literally. Sakura managed a weak smile. Yeah. He's put up a wall between us and him, and it reminds me so much of Sasuke. She looked at her feet, shoulders sagging. I think I would have liked to live with the knowledge that Naruto missed us in death, rather than becoming this. The two lapsed into silence as they reluctantly moved to eat their rations. Sai elected to take watch first after they cleared up their things, preparing to leave at the first sight of daylight. The last thing Sakura did was to adjust the blanket she'd thrown over Naruto, while Naruto slept on. Soon, so too did Sakura. The next morning, Sakura woke shivering, her breath coming in trembling puffs. This alone was strange, considering that it was midsummer near Konoha of all places. Cold was the last thing she should be feeling. And ice was the last thing she should be seeing. She sat up, staring down at her arms, seeing a thin layer of frost covering her skin. She looked around in shock, seeing that Sai had also fallen asleep and definitely didn't wake her up for guard duty, but saw that he was covered in ice as well. The air was biting and frigid, and she was both panicked and confused as to how nothing had hurt them while they were vulnerable. Then she saw a rogue ninja, standing mid-lurch with a kunai in hand, frozen completely solid, right next to Naruto. Who was curled up, on his side, trembling, and was very, very obviously doing poorly. Oh, that was not good. She stumbled up, shivering and almost slipping on the ice that stretched out around them, and went over to Naruto's side. Strangely, he didn't have a hint of frost on him. Naruto's breathing wasn't even, and his pallor was even paler than before. She reached to feel for a pulse, only to yank her hand away in shock. She'd been burned. Not by how hot he was, but by how cold he was. The air around him, now that she thought of it, was equally cold and unpleasant, and she could see her breath. She remembered the ice he'd used to attack, remembered the and then hesitated. He must be the one doing this, she thought quietly. It was the only explanation. She saw his lips moving wordlessly, and then sounds in a low, hoarse murmur. She leaned down, listening. "Hi," Naruto slurred out, his brow twitching. "Hi Orochimaru." "No, don't." He lapsed back into silence, body growing slack once again. The cold seemed to die down, though the damage it had incurred remained. Sakura frowned deeply, brushing his hair out of his face and studying his expression. The facial shape was so reminiscent of the Naruto she used to know, his eyes, his nose, everything matched if not for the strangely colored hair and the even stranger garb she wore. It was all so strange. Surreal, really. "Sai," she called out. Sai's eyes peeled open slowly, weighed down by frost, and he immediately jumped to his feet, stumbling to stay on his feet with the frozen ground around him. "Where what?" His eyes widened. "I fell asleep." "But it seems Naruto had something to do with it," Sakura said, looking down at the white-haired Jinchuriki. "The entire area is frozen over and also, that." She pointed at the frozen rogue ninja. Sai stared at the frozen statue of a person as well, and then bowed his head. "I am sorry," he said quietly, "I needlessly endangered us." Sakura didn't really blame him, but the apology was accepted. "Let's get back to Konoha. The border isn't too much farther from here, we can go by foot to avoid being detected on the last stretch." She pulled Naruto up on her shoulders and then took to the treetops. Sai followed after. They didn't talk about the frozen clearing or the frozen adversary they'd left behind. Arriving at the gates was a menial affair, at first. Then the guards were reluctant to let them back in. "You're not supposed to be back so soon, much less on your own when the rest of your assigned teammates for this mission are unaccounted for," one guard said, stepping forward. "We had urgent news to bring back, the rest of our team is to continue without us," Sai replied with a mellow smile. Sakura glared. "You know us," she snapped, growing increasingly irritable. "We need to get to the hospital so just let us in." The second guard frowned. "Look, Sakura, we're just doing our job." The back and forth bickering would have continued, Sakura was sure of that. But the sound of heels distracted them, and they turned to the source of the sound that was approaching the gates. The two shinobi on guard duty bowed on a knee. "Tsunade-sama." Shikamaru sent a hawk ahead, explaining what happened, Tsunade said, her eyes going straight to the limp figure on Sakura's back. Shizune smiled as she finally caught up to Tsunade, clasping her hands together. "You're permitted re-entry and will not be penalized for returning from your mission early." Sai bowed his head. "Thank you," he said. Now as the pair approached the gate, the guards didn't stop them, and Tsunade and Shizune flanked them as they started for the Konoha hospital. "So that really is?" Shizune began, looking Naruto over. "We believe so," Sai said. "Kabuto used a technique he explained was Ito Tensei, but something went wrong. Then, he appeared where Naruto was supposed to be standing. He was different than what he used to be. But he lost control to the Kyuubi, and he defended Hinata." Tsunade frowned. "We'll both have to have a proper look at him." "I would be grateful for the help, Tsunade-sama," Sakura said, managing a weak smile. "Sai," Tsunade said, firmly, as the hospital came into sight. "Go inform Kakashi." Sai nodded and split away from the group, heading to the cage tower. Tsunade entered the front doors, ignoring anyone who tried to speak to her. The staff got the message quickly to get out of her way with how she stormed forward with a purpose. Sakura and Shizune followed behind her, and anyone who tried to catch a glimpse of the strange boy that Sakura was carrying along couldn't find anything that would explain the strange tense solemn air to the group of Kunoichi. If, to the civilians in the hospital, he looked a little more transparent than people normally did, they opted not to mention it. Tsunade took the first unoccupied first aid room she found, and Sakura laid Naruto down on it, taking the sash and the sheathed sword off his shoulder. Once he was there, Tsunade undid the sash of the Hakama Haimo and then pulled off the Kozode and Shitage. Shizune took them in hand, looking the cloth over and frowning. "These will need to be repaired," she said softly. She looked at the third garment that Tsunade only shrugged off Naruto and sighed. "So will that one." She and Sakura continued to watch as Tsunade placed her hands against his chest, beginning to channel her chakra to see what exactly was going on with Naruto. "So Kabuto attempted Ito Tensei," Tsunade said, her voice low. Sakura nodded quietly, folding her hands over her lap as she sat, allowing Tsunade the chance to perform an examination before helping her heal. "But he does not appear how he died." Obito attempted to tether Naruto's soul in a body with a sacrifice, Sakura explained, her voice low. As Sai explained before. But the body seemed to freeze and then shattered. There was a butterfly that flew from the splintering body and then he was just there. Standing amidst the shattered ice. It was as if the technique went wrong, Tsunade said slowly, right? Sakura paused and then her eyes widened slightly. Yes. Almost like that. Kabuto didn't look pleased by the turn of events. I would imagine, Tsunade said, slowly, looking intently at her own hands, that the presence of this different energy that seems to be predominant in his body may have had something to do with the disruption of his jutsu and of our own. Sakura stared at her. What? Your healing didn't heal him to the same degree that you normally heal, Tsunade said, a frown set on her face. And even just probing with my chakra to investigate his wounds, the energy is reacting poorly with my chakra. She held up her hands, showing off the slow creeping layer of frost that had started to grow up her fingers. It's not chakra? Sakura asked again, dumbfounded. Tsunade shook her head as she rubbed off the sheet of frost, folding her hands over Naruto's chest proper. The telltale green glow of her healing jutsu dimly illuminated the room, and Sakura jumped to her feet, joining in with the healing. Naruto remained still, and Sakura, now paying more attention to the body under her hands, realized that Tsunade was right. You're right, it's as if his entire body is made of this energy, Sakura said slowly. Would it be possible, Shizune asked contemplatively, if this is some sort of energy connected with death? If the body that Kabuto's jutsu was constructing was destroyed perhaps, this isn't a body we're dealing with. The two medics looked sharply to Shizune, and the woman shrank a bit under the intenseness of their combined gazes. Shizune, you're a genius, Sakura said, her eyes lighting up. That makes sense. Her hands faltered for a moment as she looked down at the prone figure on the table. This isn't a body, so then, how do we help him? We will do what we can, Tsunade said firmly, her gaze back on her hands. After that, we can only wait for his form to heal naturally and his energy to replenish. After an intense session of healing everything they could, Naruto was changed by hospital staff into standard hospital clothing and then placed into a recovery room. Tsunade invited Sakura to do a round of the hospital and, during that time, spoke of her theories regarding Naruto's current state. She talked about how she believed Naruto's strength was actually depleted as they had no way of knowing exactly how strong he really was in terms of ascertaining his current strength. It was the only seeming explanation for Naruto to not be awake when he was originally conscious when he had arrived back in the world. Sakura, after helping Tsunade on the round of the hospital, returned to that very room, finding Sai already there. She wordlessly took a seat by Sai, watching the rise and fall of Naruto's chest. No words were said in the endless expanse of silence that stretched on, each lost to their own thoughts. Finally, they both agreed to leave his side, if only to find something to eat for lunch. When they came back to the hospital, Naruto still hadn't improved. And so between running errands, training, and their daily lives, they waited. Things didn't change even when everyone else got back. That alone was almost disappointing to Sakura, as she'd hoped to have answers for everyone. The only thing she could say for certain is that Naruto's strength was definitely building back up, which made her wonder just how much more he had to recover. All they had was speculation, shots in the dark regarding anything related to Naruto as he was now. She and Sai met the group at the gate. They all looked varying levels of anxious, as if hanging on to a breath for some sort of news. He's not awake yet, Sakura said, quietly. This let out some of the tension in the group, though disappointment was the predominant sentiment she could see off them all. But from Tsunade Sama's examination, we know beyond a shadow of a doubt that this is. She looked around at the group. Who we think it is. Then Kiba began, but Shino held up a hand. Kiba looked up and Hinata clasped her hands together. Not here, Shino said, quietly. Too many ears. Take us to him, Sakura, Sai. Yes, Sai replied. The group followed after, catching a few glances from civilians and other shinobi alike, however, knowing how close the group was, they were left alone. The trip to the hospital was silent and tense, and only when they arrived in the hospital room did the tension come to a head. Kiba began, staring at the boy. That's him. That can't be. It is, Shino and Niji both cut in at the same time. Niji's Byakugan was active, and a few of Shino's bugs were drifting in the air. Even though his energy is much different than chakra, the patterns of it are very distinct. His eyes narrowed a bit. And that coil of demonic chakra is still there, even if it's dormant at the moment. Kiba looked over to Akamaru, who made a low whine. You're right, he sighed, reluctantly. I didn't want to believe it. He looks weird, but the smell doesn't lie. Even if it's also weird. He frowned. What do you mean, Kiba-san? He asked. Weird, Shino said slowly, is how his very presence registers as dangerous to my insects. His energy feels like death to them. Weird is how he doesn't smell like he's from anywhere in this world, Kiba added, lip twitching in a not so subtle baring of his teeth. Tenten folded her arms, frowning. Well, we're not going to get any answers on why he's so weird until he wakes up. She looked to Sakura, frowning. Do you know when that will be? Sakura wrung her hands. Well, Tsunade-sama and I both have a working hypothesis that something drained him of most of his strength to the point that he can't sustain consciousness, she explained quietly. It's only theory, but he has been building up more energy. But we have no idea of knowing what his cap is, Niji realized, slowly. So we don't have any idea at all. Sakura nodded solemnly, closing her eyes. The room lapsed into silence until Ino took in a deep breath. I have an idea, she said, and then she held up her hands, thumbs, index fingers, and middle fingers connected in a circular form, ring and pinky fingers splayed out. Both Choji and Shikamaru recognized this seal intimately. Wait, Shikamaru said sharply, looking back over to Ino and raising a hand. Don't. But before he could say anything, she'd completed her mind transfer jutsu. He caught her as she slumped, and the rest of the Konoha 11 realized in that moment what had happened. It was only a beat after that Ino shot straight up again, her breath coming out in a shivering wisp of visible air, her eyes wide open. He's not human, she breathed in a horrified whisper. Not anymore. Sakura froze. She looked Ino dead in the eye. What? He's a Shinigami, she said, softly. Time moves faster for him. Or something, I don't know, the things I found were fragmented and scattered before I met the dragon. Orochimaru, Hinata whispered. Sakura and Shikamaru looked over to her, surprise on both their faces, but she now was focused solely on Ino. The dragon, it was made of ice. Yeah, Ino replied, wrapping her arms around herself. I'm so cold. When I went into his mind it was different from any other mind I've gone into. It was this field of ice. And I could grasp bits of his thoughts and his last bits of consciousness, but then the dragon came, it looked hurt, but it was furious. This is a lot to unpack, Tenten interrupted, sitting down roughly into one of the chairs in the cramped hospital room. So what you're saying is that Naruto is a Shinigami now, and he's got a dragon in his head, too. I didn't find the Kyuubi in his mind, but I felt it, Ino added quietly, rubbing her arms. But it felt really far away. Orochimaru appears to be part of his new abilities, Shikamaru said, sorely wishing he could smoke a cigarette at that moment. Weather manipulation and temperature modulation seems to factor into that. He had called upon an ice dragon to bust open the cavern we were in, and then rose up an obelisk of ice. Then, the thing that stopped his four-tailed form was ice. It's his spirit energy that's cold, Sakura cut in, shaking her head. Shikamaru rose an eyebrow and Sakura looked away. When Tsunade-sama and I were healing him, we were in close contact with his spirit energy. It felt like ice, and when she was examining him, frost started climbing her fingers. Spirit energy, Niji said, slowly, giving Sakura a look that clearly asked for an explanation. That's the only way I can think to explain it, Sakura elaborated. The Kyuubi's chakra is the biggest reservoir of chakra that he has still left with him. He still has a little chakra of his own left, but the largest supply of energy he has in his body is something that definitely isn't chakra, and it's not very compatible with chakra. Will Naruto be okay? Lee asked. Oh, it'd be awful for something to happen to him again, especially with everyone's hopes up and with the springtime of youth at its peak. Enough with the springtime talk, Kiba snapped irritably. I want to know what's going on, and I want to know it from him. Not us all just shooting the shit, I want to know what the hell is going on. You're going to have to wait for those answers, Shino cut in quietly. Theory and guesswork is all we have until the source of this conversation wakes up. Taoji looked to Naruto and then looked away. It's been a long time since he's been with us, he said, shoving a handful of chips into his mouth rather anxiously. I feel that it's a blessing in disguise, actually, Shikamaru said. We can think more logically about what's happening here. And we've had more time to establish our war forces for whenever the Akatsuki makes good on its threat of war. Silence fell in the room. Only the sound of the rustling leaves outside the window and Naruto's quiet breaths filled the room. But then. How long has it been? Naruto finally woke up. Hitsugaya kept his eyes shut, barely even half conscious as he heard wisps of conversation around him. He neglected the conversation in place of investigating just how awful he felt in that moment. He only recalled hazy fever dreams of Orochimaru, wounded, of the Kyuubi attacking viciously from where he could, and of being caught in the middle. He didn't know what to make of the memories, fleeting as they were, and soon enough they'd slipped right through his fingers into ash. Ash. He almost missed Matsumoto, which was enough to have him aware of how he'd never admit that to her face. She'd just smother him with her bosom. But now everything ached in a special, miserable sort of way he hadn't felt in so long. He regretted being able to feel and decided to neglect moving at that moment. Besides, it appeared that no one around him had even noticed he was barely conscious. He could hear the tail end of their conversation, and he frowned. Well. He might as well speak up at some point. How long has it been? The rasping voice of the captain cut through the room, catching the attention of the ninja by his bedside. Hitsugaya's eyes opened slowly and he stared straight to the ceiling, unmoving. It's been 3 days since the fight with Kabuto. We all just arrived back in Konoha, but you've been unconscious at the Konoha hospital, Ino said, frowning. Frustration crossed Hitsugaya's expression for a fleeting moment. No. Since I died. The question hung heavy in the silence and there was nothing they could say. The pain was still fresh. 5 years, Sakura said, her own voice hoarse, her mouth dry as she remembered that horrible day. There was a soft breath and she looked over, seeing the captain's eyes, so blue, just like Naruto's, staring up at the ceiling in shock. That's not possible, Hitsugaya replied, his voice a mere gasp. That can't be right. What do you mean? Shikamaru peeled an eye open as he posed the question, leaning forward on his chair. Hitsugaya shuffled, taking a breath. I've been dead much longer than that, he replied, struggling to sit up. He regulated his breathing though it came harsh, eyes squeezing shut. I don't understand, time does not work like that, He went silent. Hitsugaya stood in the sewers. It had been so long since he'd gone so deep into his inner world and he looked around, brow furrowing in confusion. Orochimaru? He called. There was no response, his voice carrying in the dank expanse. His lip curled, but he moved forward, feet sloshing uncomfortably in the water before he found the room he always tried to avoid under every circumstance. Two bright red eyes opened, peering down at him. There was a malice-filled curl to the fox's lips, and he spoke, his voice thundering in the room and demanding respect, fear. Nothing that Hitsugaya would give him. What do you think happens when you tear away a part of a whole to another pocket of the universe? Hitsugaya's thoughts raced, his brow furrowing. He couldn't piece together what that meant, knowing how cryptic the fox always was. He had been far from this world for too long to be able to weave together such a riddle so quickly, especially when still missing so many pieces. A part of a whole? He asked quietly. There was a harsh laugh, and a wave of ire washed through the young captain. It was downright mockery, what the Kyuubi was giving him right now. If you can't puzzle that out now, brat, then you're not yet worthy of the answer. Hitsugaya jolted back to awareness as he slumped back into the bed, blinking rapidly to the ceiling. Perspective, have you been dead? He took a few moments, taking some breaths to relax. My apologies, he replied cautiously, half apprehensive of the fox pulling him back in, can you repeat yourself? How long, in your perspective, have you been dead? Shikamaru asked again. Hitsugaya looked away. A century, he replied, voice soft. It's been so long since I've seen any of you. I never thought that would happen again. He went quiet. Perhaps that was for the best. For the best? Ino asked, quietly. He turned sharply, staring in alarm. He hadn't expected to see others beyond Shikamaru, Kiba and Sakura, and thus found himself shocked to see everyone from the Konoha genin standing there, gathered around him. Shino, Niji, Hinata, Ino, Lee, Tenten, Choji, Sai. He took a soft breath, stunned, confusion and anguish in his gaze, as he wondered why they still cared. He had been gone for so long now that he had, after remembering, believed that they couldn't possibly be thinking about him anymore. That raw emotion was quickly buried, his eyes hard again as he furrowed his brow. Yes. I was weaker-willed before, and now I am not. Whatever I must do to return to Sarate can be done without lingering attachment to the material world. The matter-of-factness to his voice took everyone aback. What are you talking about, Naruto? You can't just leave, you bastard. You have to stay, we need you here. Kiba's voice was loud, angry, and confused. Hitsugaya knew he was upset, knew that he was hurting, and that they must miss him. But he had been gone for too long for a reconciliation between living and dead to be possible, hadn't remembered them long enough to feel a real connection. That was the name of a ninja who died, the captain replied, looking back to the ceiling. My name is Hitsugaya Toshiro, and I would appreciate the respect, Inuzuka. What kind of bullshit justifies this sort of behavior? There's nothing that should have changed the bull-headed stubborn Naruto into you. Kiba's movements were jerky, erratic as he threw his hand out in agitation to gesture wildly. You're almost like Sasuke. Kiba froze at the frigid glare that was leveled at him. Don't speak to me as if you know what I've gone through, Hitsugaya hissed, eyes narrowed in annoyance. The comparison was ill-received. You know what I've experienced in life. You know not of what I've experienced in death. It will remain that way. I need to leave this place and return to my post. He sat back up again, a strain to his temple as he pushed himself out of the bed. He wobbled precariously and then settled his stance. He was clearly not at his full strength yet, but he was a man on a mission. Where's my clothing? I need to. He lurched as he was struck in the chest, Niji standing before him, palm outstretched in the Hyuga's gentle fist style. His vision blotched out into darkness and he collapsed into a heap. Niji caught him, expression flat yet almost solemn, and he gently eased the once again unconscious captain back into the bed. He's changed. Not for the better. Hitsugaya's eyes opened next and, although he resented that he'd been felled by Niji's attack, he couldn't fault the logic in the action, much to his chagrin. He really did feel better now, enough to get up and do what had to be done. He shuffled, wheezing softly, and slowly sat up. Now there was only the matter of figuring out what to wear, as his. He turned and sighed in relief. Oh, there it was. His shihakusho and haori, neatly cleaned and folded and fixed. Hyoranmeru was laid across the cloth, thankfully intact. He remembered, briefly, that he'd felt a breeze on his back after the attack from Kabuto and knew that someone had to have sewn up the tears in the uniform. That gesture, in the least, was appreciated and he supposed he had to find who did the mending and thank them for their effort. He stood fully, taking his clothes, and then changed, pausing momentarily to look down at the reappearance of a seal he'd hoped to never see again. This world really was affecting him already. He had to get out. He closed his eyes, then, slipping the rest of the attire on and affixing his haori and zanpakuto in place. With a shunpo he left the room, then, landing on the roofs. He stood fully as he looked around the village. Things seemed so normal again. His expression was almost mournful as he took it all in. The last time he'd seen the village, it was in ruin, and it being returned made his chest ache. Still, he supposed, this was a better spot than any to return home. Drawing Hyoranmeru from its sheath, he held the blade perpendicular to the ground, blade facing the sky. He focused his rear yoku and then moved the blade parallel to the ground, pushing it forward. But it didn't work. The blade did not slot into the space to open the Sinkamen as it was supposed to. Taken aback by the inconvenience, Hitsugaya repeated the procedure, his lip curling. Open, he snapped, twisting the blade. Again, it failed. No summoning of the familiar doors, no Jigakucho, no nothing. This wasn't good. Maybe Hyoranmeru would be able to shed some light on what was going on. He sat down in a meditation pose to perform Jinzen and carefully wedged Hyoranmeru into the ground enough to stay upright. He placed his hands on his ankles and closed his eyes, letting out a breath as he began to clear his mind, focusing on Hyoranmeru's presence so he could enter his inner world and speak with him. Only seconds, minutes, what seemed like far too long passed, and Hitsugaya's eyes snapped open as he realized he couldn't feel Hyoranmeru's presence. Not properly. He swallowed, stress growing before he shook his head. No. This wasn't something to worry about. He'd just woken up. He'd been unconscious for a time, if what Ino said was anything to go off of. He just had to relax. Wait for it. Work at it. That's all his life was, in the end. Working towards complete mastery of himself. And so he closed his eyes, worked on his breathing, and he continued to meditate. In the end, Hitsugaya didn't really know exactly how long he'd spent meditating on the roof. But in the midst of his attempted meditation, he felt a presence nearby. He turned his head slightly and then opened his eyes. The light flooded his eyes and he squinted a bit but luckily had no audience to his disorientation. Still, he had to address the new presence. I am aware that you are there, he said, voice laden with annoyance. You seem more perceptive than I thought you could be, before, Kakashi said as he stepped out into the open. Hitsugaya huffed, looking out at the village. I have learned and grown much on my own after I died, he said, standing up finally to pull Hyoranmeru out of the roof. He was certain he'd have no further opportunity to meditate today, and so he sheathed the blade, looking back to Kakashi. What brings you here? Curiosity. You were dead for 5 years, you realize, Kakashi replied, though he paused for a moment before speaking again. I suppose, from what your friends have said, it's been longer for you than it has been for us. That is correct, Hitsugaya replied. He moved to sit down, looking down to the streets below. Kakashi joined him there at the edge and they sat together for a time, watching everyone else's lives carrying on. Kakashi studied Hitsugaya discreetly, just as Hitsugaya studied him, and as the silence carried on, Kakashi built up an idea of how to proceed. So he decided to start cautiously. May I ask about your hair? Upon my death, my Ryoku the soul's form of chakra developed, the captain explained. It's an ice type, and due to its quantity and power, I believe that it may have had some influence in the matter. Well, a start was a start. At the least he wasn't shut down or given a non-answer, though he supposed it was a redundant question due to the knowledge that Sakura had already gathered. Ice type, huh? Kakashi mused. I suppose it's a combination of your wind-type chakra and a water affinity. There was another lull, and Hitsugaya sighed, then, keeping his composure only by the skin of his teeth. You didn't come here to simply sit in silence. What else do you want to know? How did death change you so much? Kakashi asked. What was death like for you to change you from the Naruto we knew? There was another pause as Hitsugaya sighed, trying to think of the best and most diplomatic way to handle this. He could feel something prickling under his skin after all the time he'd been gone, his temper raising beyond that which he really wanted to acknowledge at this time. My afterlife is my own business. I've become accustomed to my privacy. Apologies, Haddock, but the meddling is ill-received. Then maybe I can ask about your outfit? The Jounin asked. Hitsugaya sorely wanted to pinch his brow, but he held himself back, not wanting to express his annoyance at all the questions. I am a high-ranking official in Sirte, the captain replied. The black shahakusho is a standard uniform. The haori is a signifier of my rank. It makes you look like your father, Kakashi said. He noted the subtle slump to Hitsugaya's shoulders. Perhaps it was a cruel twist of fate, Hitsugaya said, softly, but I didn't go where everyone else seems to go. There was no paradise, no final rest. No seeing my parents, no being at peace. For a while I didn't even remember everyone. Souls are wiped of their memories when they pass on to where I went. Something terrible happened to me, and then I remembered. He looked at the cityscape as the sun set over it, expression wistful. He remembered waking up after Mayuri had removed that Quincy's influence from him, disoriented and recalling his life in disjointed flashbacks that left him in a cold sweat. Luckily, not during the war effort itself, but in the shaky aftermath and recovery following the war. It had been a trying time. I still had things I had to do, I suppose. Kakashi inclined his head. After all that, he was certain that pushing Hitsugaya any further wouldn't be wise. Thank you for your trust. Hitsugaya turned to face Kakashi proper, surprise in his eyes as his lips parted for a moment. How? Kakashi smiled behind the mask, expression saddening a bit. Your friends mentioned the name. With the person you are now, you seem like you'd prefer to be called that. Hitsugaya settled a bit and Kakashi saw his face soften, feeling glad that he was able to get through even a little bit to the captain. You are correct in that regard. He paused then. Thank you, Kakashi-sensei. Kakashi felt a little bit of hope at that. It was a step up from being called by his last name. If you need anything, you'll find me, Kakashi said, getting up. Hitsugaya twitched, but whether it was out of annoyance or something else, Kakashi couldn't tell. The help that I currently require is beyond what you can offer, but I appreciate the gesture. Kakashi felt pity for Hitsugaya in the end. Oh, yes. I thought you'd like to know, Kakashi called from across the rooftop, almost as if recounting an afterthought. Your apartment has been maintained even while vacant. Your friends have watched it. As it's yours, you can stay there until you figure things out. Hitsugaya turned to look at him just as he disappeared with a body flicker, wondering exactly how Kakashi had managed to puzzle together the difficulty he was having in returning home. He ultimately decided not to think on it too much, Kakashi had always been quite the enigma. Now, with the knowledge he had, Hitsugaya decided to investigate the apartment that he used to call home. With the quarters he now boasted in the Squad 10 barracks, he could officially say his rooming quarters were quite cramped in life. But then again, when did he ever spend his time indoors? Hitsugaya grimaced. Perhaps he would have benefited from staying indoors more and facing less of the hatred that he did in life, he thought, clutching at his stomach where the seal hit in its unactivated state. No judging eyes, no hostility perhaps, in both lives, if he had possessed foresight he would have led a happier life in seclusion. It was too late to turn back the clock and question the what-ifs, however, and he proceeded onward, using his finesse and shunpo to bridge the gap between the hospital and his former home. He climbed in through the window once he arrived, seeing it open, and he frowned deeply at what he saw. Everything stayed the same. Not a single thing had been moved. At least, furniture-wise. Still, little things had changed. Hitsugaya found this out when he looked in the cupboard and saw that food had been taken out, replaced with new food. So that meant that people visited his apartment regularly, enough to empty the reserves and replace them diligently. That was both reassuring and disappointing in a way that brought a sharp unexpected ache to his chest. How could they visit only after he died? How could they visit his home so regularly when he was dead, yet not visit him nearly as frequent when he was right there? In his anger, he grabbed a glass from the pantry and hurled it at a wall just to watch it shatter. His chest heaved in the aftermath, and then he felt both silly and stupid in the aftermath. What had that gained him? Why was he lashing out? Why was he losing control of himself like this? The answers eluded him, and they troubled him. So the only thing left for him to do was meditate. He entered his bedroom, looking around, and his face fell at the sight of the reminders of his life. Photographs he had kept, precious mementos of his friends and his happiness, that now lurked in the shadows and reminded him of all the little things he'd lost. He went around, systematically, putting each photograph down and swearing to never look at them again. People who were gone, that he didn't get closure with by meeting them in the afterlife, and people that were there, but now so long separated from him that there was nothing left to say. With each photo, his chest ached more, his memories threatening to derail him. The less time he spent here, the better. Then, he arrived to the most precious photo. Sakura. Sasuke. Kakashi. himself. They were all there. So young. So naive. So unaware of how cruel and relentless and unforgiving the world would be. Hitsugaya felt so distant from the person that there was only a hollow feeling that lingered in him, a lump forming in his throat the longer he looked at it. He didn't put that photo down. He slotted high Orochimaru in the floorboards and meditated instead. So this part ends here. Alright, that's it for today's video guys. Let me know in the comments section how was the story, and also don't forget to like, share and subscribe. I will meet you in another video. Bye bye.